Question 65 of Prima of the Summa Theologia has to do with the connection of the virtues. And I find this very interesting because I've often heard, especially listening to Catholic radio or Catholic experts talk, that the virtues are like all or nothing. You either have all of them or you have none. And that always seemed kind of odd to me that, that would be the case. Well, it really isn't the case, but in some ways it is. And so you're going to see in these 5 articles, St. Thomas Aquinas explaining the connection of the virtues and which ones you can't have without the other ones, and in what case you can have some without the others. And I find it pretty fascinating, and of course it's very practical as well. The first one is whether the moral virtues are connected with one another. So the moral virtues would be like temperance and fortitude and things like chastity and even religion, which falls under justice, would be a moral virtue as well. So he says moral virtue may be considered either as perfect or imperfect. Now this is going to be the distinction that he makes about whether it's all or nothing, right? An imperfect moral virtue, temperance for instance, or fortitude, is nothing but an inclination in us to do some kind of good deed, whether such inclination may be in us by nature or by habituation, by habit, by doing it over and over again. If we take the moral virtues in this way, they are not connected, since we find men who by natural temperament are by being accustomed prompt in doing deeds of liberality, but are not prompt in doing deeds of chastity. And so I think that's a great example, because you probably have seen people that are very immoral in some ways, like Thomas mentions, like chastity. They're cheating on their wives, or they're fornicating, but they might be very generous and they might help the poor, and so it's hard to say they have no virtue at all, but Thomas is saying it's imperfect virtue. All right, he goes on. He says the perfect moral virtue is a habit that inclines us to do a good deed well, and if we take moral virtues in this way, we must say that they are connected, as nearly all are agreed in saying. For this, 2 reasons are given, corresponding to the different ways of assigning the distinction of the cardinal virtues. Some distinguish them according to certain general properties of the virtues. For instance, by saying that discretion belongs to prudence, rectitude to justice, moderation to temperance, and strength of mind to fortitude. So these are like sub-virtues within the cardinal virtue, right? In whatever matter we consider these properties to be. In this way, the reason for the connection is evident, for strength of mind is not commended as virtuous if it be without moderation or rectitude or discretion, and so forth. This too is the reason assigned for the connection by St. Gregory, who says that a virtue cannot be perfect as a virtue if isolated from the others. So you can't just have one virtue and then all by itself and then none of the other ones. For there can be no true prudence without temperance, justice without and fortitude, and he continues to speak in like manner of the other virtues. Augustine also gives the same reason. All right, so that's the first way that they are connected. Others, however, differentiate these virtues in respect of their matters. And in this way, Aristotle assigns the reason for their connection, because, as stated above, no moral virtue can be without prudence. Since it is proper to moral virtue to make a right choice, for it is an elective habit. Now, right choice requires not only the inclination to the due end, which inclination is the direct outcome of moral virtue, but also correct choice in things conducive to the end, which choice is made by prudence that counsels, judges, and commands in those things that are directed to the end. In like manner, one cannot have prudence unless one has the moral virtues, since prudence is right reason about things to be done, and the starting point of reason is the end of the thing to be done, to which end man is rightly disposed by moral virtue. So I already talked about that previously, the connection. Anytime there is a good deed that's done, you're going to have a moral virtue and also an intellectual virtue as well. And as I recall, St. Thomas Aquinas said that understanding also is an intellectual virtue that has to be connected with all of the moral virtues, right? Article 2, whether moral virtue can be without charity. He says, It is possible by means of human works to acquire moral virtues insofar as they produce good works that are directed to an end not surpassing the natural power of man. And when they are acquired thus, they can be without charity, even as they were in many of the Gentiles. So we can do some good actions that are of a natural level, okay, down here below, but if they're going to be lifted up to the supernatural realm, then they have to have charity and they have to all be connected. But insofar as they produce good works in proportion to a supernatural last end, thus they have the character of virtue truly and perfectly and cannot be acquired by human acts, but are infused by God. Such like moral virtues cannot be without charity. Now notice he said there that the moral virtues are infused, okay? The other moral virtues cannot be without prudence, and that prudence cannot be without the moral virtues, because these latter make man well disposed to certain ends, which are the starting point of the procedure of prudence. Okay, we already talked about that. Now, for prudence to proceed right, it is much more necessary that man be well disposed towards his ultimate end, which is the effect of charity, than that he be well disposed in respect of other ends, which is the effect of moral virtues, just as in speculative matters right reason has greatest need of the first indemonstrable principle, that contradictories cannot both be true at the same time. It is therefore evident that neither can infused prudence be without charity, nor consequently the other moral virtues, since they cannot be without prudence. And so I hope you can see how this really, he's describing it as perfect versus imperfect, natural versus supernatural, and so there are possibilities that the virtues can be unconnected down here, but not at this level. It's therefore clear from what has been said that only the infused virtues are perfect and deserve to be called virtues simply, since they direct man well to the ultimate end. But the other virtues, those namely that are acquired, are virtues in a restricted sense, but not simply, for they direct man well in respect of the last end in some particular genus or action, but not in respect of the last end simply. All right, Article 3, these last three articles are shorter. Whether charity can be without moral virtue. Okay, can you have charity and not the moral virtues? All the moral virtues are infused together with charity. The reason for this is that God operates no less perfectly in works of grace than in works of nature. Now, in the works of nature, we find that whenever a thing contains a principle of a certain work, it has also whatever is necessary for the execution. Thus, example, animals are provided with organs whereby to perform the actions that their soul empowers them to do. Now, it is evident that charity, inasmuch as it directs man to his last end, is the principle of all good works that are referable to his last end. Wherefore, all the moral virtues must needs be infused together with charity, since it is through them that man performs each different kind of good work. And so this is where they're all lumped together. That if you have the virtue of charity, you're going to have all the moral virtues infused at the same time, which is a little bit confusing, because I understand that you can't have charity, the virtue of charity, without the moral virtues, but if God infuses it, like we have infused charity at baptism, so how exactly does that mean that, because not everybody that's baptized seems to be, responding to that supernatural virtue of charity. All right, so one little last sentence here. If it is therefore clear that the infused moral virtues are connected, not only through prudence, but also on account of charity, and again, that whoever loses charity through mortal sin forfeits all the infused moral virtues. Okay, so in that regard, it is all or nothing. Whether faith and hope can be without charity. Faith and hope, like the moral virtues, can be considered in two ways. First, in an inchoate state, which means like a beginning state. Secondly, as complete virtues. For since virtue is directed to the doing of good works, perfect virtue is that which gives the faculty of doing a work perfectly good, and this consists in not only doing what is good, but also in doing it well. Else, in what is done is good, but not done well, it will not be perfectly good. Wherefore, neither will the habit that is the principle of such an act have a perfect character of virtue. So, what he's going to get at here is that faith and hope are possible in an inchoate early stage well, but once they become perfect virtues, it's impossible to separate them from the theological virtue of charity. Finally, he asks the other question, whether charity can be without faith and hope. I was a little surprised by this answer because I've often heard, and well, Thomas teaches, that in heaven we won't need faith and hope because those are, faith is that you're hoping for something that you don't yet possess. And you have faith in something that you know, but you're not resting in it yet. But he takes a different take here. He says charity signifies not only the love of God, but also a certain friendship with him, which implies, besides love, a certain mutual return of love together with mutual communion. That this belongs to charity is evident from 1 John 4:16. He that abideth in charity abideth in me, and God in him. And also 1 Corinthians 1:9, where it is written, God is faithful, by whom you are called unto the fellowship of his Son. Now this fellowship of man with God, which consists in a certain familiar colloquy with him, is begun here in life by grace, but will be perfected in the future life by glory, each of which things we hold by faith and hope. Wherefore, just as friendship with a person would be impossible if one disbelieved in or despaired of the possibility of their friendship or familiar colloquy, so too friendship with God, which is charity, is impossible without faith, so as to believe in this fellowship and colloquy with God and to hope to attain to this fellowship. Therefore, charity is quite impossible without faith and hope. But again, I do think he says that in heaven, the faith and the hope will no longer be necessary, but I guess you still have it, but it's not necessary. Maybe you don't have to use it, but you still have it. I'm not quite sure. All right, that'll do it for question 65 of Prima Secunda, the connection of the virtues. I hope this helped you understand how these virtues are all connected and in some ways not connected. God bless you.